We've just experienced an insane year of downhill racing. The men's elite finished in a way we didn't expect it to, Valley dominated, and the junior categories were both amazing to watch. Next year's racing is going to be absolutely wild. But what are the main tech stories from 2025? Let's find out. At MBUK, we are massive fans of downhill racing, so over the past, 6-8 months, we've been scouring photos, videos and live streams to find the biggest tech stories from the year of racing. Rob, you've been involved in downhill for a long time yourself. This season's been pretty cool.
That's right, Tom. We've seen some really cool stuff come to light this year. Everything from new prototype bikes, prototype kit, but then there's other brands that have made bikes that look like they're actually ready to be sold to the public, which is really cool to see.
Well, let's kick off with some of the biggest tech stories, and I think the first one we're going to talk about is electronic suspension. Clearly this is something that's coming up across the world of mountain biking, from XC all the way through to downhill. Probably not Rampage though.
Probably not Rampage, no.
But it's kind of made a bit of an impact in downhill, and we've seen some big flashy lights all over people's handlebars. What's going on?
That's right, so brands like RockShox have the flight attendant system, Fox have live valve, Öhlins have whatever they have, which is only on the specialised Gravity Team bikes. I think maybe a year or two ago we'd only see it on select riders' bikes, maybe it wasn't quite ready, but this year it feels like it's en masse. You know, anyone sponsored by any of those teams, with the exception of Öhlins potentially, are running it.
Why are people using them though?
To save as much time as they possibly can.
To go faster.
Yep, basically it allows you to be in the optimum suspension setting for that section of track, and with something like live valve or flight attendant, you're not having to push any buttons, it does the thinking for you.
Okay.
Whereas I think on the Öhlins system, I could be wrong, it's hard to know, but it looks like those guys are pressing their gamer control buttons on their bars.
I think one thing people noticed certainly at the start of this season, and I don't think it's been present later on, was lights on people's handlebars. I think telling the riders kind of which mode they're in. Might have been linked to a button so they could change it, but certainly at the end of the season, the RockShox riders, there ain't no buttons on there, there's no big lights on the handlebars anymore.
I think some of them will still have buttons because they'll still have the option to override stuff, potentially. So if they want to sprint and they don't think it's going to be reacting quick enough, which it probably would, but you're able to hold that down and override the system, so then it's just fully locked out or whatever you want to set it to.
Yeah.
And then you can pedal and make sure it's as efficient as possible.
I think in the previous round at Lake Placid, commentary was saying that, you know, on those motorway sections you can really stiffen up the suspension and really helps you pump and then have it fully open for the rough, and that's the point of electronic suspension on a downhill bike. Exactly,
and obviously, you know, rounds like Leogang where there's those long motorway sections, that having that sort of equipment is gonna save you some time.
So if you want to go fast on your bike, you've got to feel things are nice and smooth, and chain flail or pedal kickback are things that can impact on how the bike feels underneath you. So this year we've seen quite a few riders racing products that kind of mitigate against that.
Exactly, and not just that, but it also, if you can get a workaround, it doesn't only just help how the bike feels and calm things down, it also can reduce rider fatigue.
Yep.
And you have a track like Munson, which is very long, very rough, very fast. If you can lessen that fatigue, you're going to be fresher at the bottom, therefore push harder,
Yep.
hopefully speed your riding up.
Okay, so we're looking at things like, well, there's O-Chain, which has just been bought by SRAM.
Yeah.
Rimpact have got their chain damper chainring, so that's where the chainring is almost independent from the crank arm, so if the chain pulls back on the top of it, the crank arms don't necessarily move.
Yep.
And then down at the hub, there's a few other solutions there as well.
Yeah, so E13 have the sidekick hub, which similarly has sort of that built-in float, which is just adjustable, and DT Swiss have just launched one similar to that.
Yeah.
So clearly there's a lot of momentum behind it in the industry.
I think what's clear is that actually if you look at, you know, the riders' bikes, even if they aren't sponsored by some of these brands, quite often you do see these products pretty much across the board these days. There aren't many bikes that don't have them on. So there must be something in there.
Yeah, and I think riders are always going to be intrigued as to what other riders have. And if they feel like they're missing out on something, you might see, you know, the next race, one of those widgets, gadgets turning up. It might be, you know, blanked out. It could be a hub, which is harder to spot.
Yeah.
Those sorts of things, and you know, it will just sort of slowly work its way around the pits until everyone's experimented and will either be written off or heavily invested in. We
did see those holographic stickers, what, about 6 years ago, especially on the common cell bikes.
Yes. Yeah, didn't seem to catch on.
No, load of bollocks. On a similar vein of, is it really effective or not, tuned mass dampers have been making an appearance. So Tumat Stamper is a weight that's suspended by some springs and you mount it to various parts of the bike, usually the handlebars and maybe the rear triangle. And the idea is that it sort of quells oscillations and brings the bike back to a more stable platform quicker. And we're seeing them hidden behind number boards, and we're seeing little ones, dinky ones, down by the rear triangles.
Not necessarily like new tech, but maybe new to the world of downhill. They seem pretty popular. We're going to see a lot of off-season testing with a lot of teams trying these things out and working out what works for them. I think Jackson runs them, so clearly works for him, or they feel like it has some kind of benefit. So there's a good chance we're just going to see that on more and more bikes.
I think the Mondrakers have been running them as well down at the back end.
Yeah.
Mondraker are clearly a team who are very happy to experiment with different things, and this is obviously one of the ones they've been doing for a couple of years now.
Loris Vergier was running it on Trek. I'm assuming he's running them on Commensal as well. So yeah, it's an interesting sort of move. Yeah. Anything to basically try and calm the handling down, save the rider a bit of energy.
When we talked about the sort of the chain flow and those chain rings or the rear hubs, those are something that a lot of like normal riders probably can benefit from and probably will feel. I think the TMDs are a little bit more niche and maybe, the cream of the crop are going to benefit from them. Most people probably not. Unless
you're really racing, it's a big investment to make maybe slightly better feel, but it isn't the end of the world, so don't feel like you need to go out and buy all of this latest tech if you're just kicking around in the woods.
I mean, if we're going to move from something that's moderately high-tech to something incredibly low-tech, people have been zip-tying weights to the bottoms of their bikes. Now, this has been going on for quite a long time. I remember Chris Porter, who developed Geometron, who works a lot with Fox suspension. I remember probably 10 years ago him putting weights on his handlebars to sort of try and make his forks feel better. But this seems to have hit the mainstream in downhill. You hear of like Jackson running 2 kilos on the bottom of his V10 to try and smooth that bike out.
But then we should probably mention Orbea, who have that link that you can bolt up to 600 kilograms, 600 grams in place. So it's obviously something on brands like that's on their radar. If they're building it into their production bikes, clearly they see value in doing that. How the mechanics have approached it varies in sort of ways. In some of the guys I've seen gluing on those little wheel weights.
Yeah, little lead weights.
Yeah, little lead weights that you would use to correct your car wheels. Then there's just roofing lead being strapped underneath, taped. However, just to try and add a bit more stability to the bike. And if anyone's ridden an e-bike, they know just how that sensation can be. You're changing the sprung to sprung mass ratio. It generally helps overcome friction in suspension. It helps them therefore boost sort of sensitivity, stuff like that. And anytime you're in such a traction, they're the bikes to ride if you're struggling, because they seem to just be glued to the ground, right? Yeah.
On a sort of similar vein, when Lou Ferguson came in and did a podcast with us, she was mentioning how she has little wheel weights opposite the valves, because when she was in the air, the wheel's spinning and she could almost feel, she could feel the weight of the valve going around, which was unsettling it. So she's been putting little weights on. I think a few of the riders have been doing that as well, just to keep those wheels spinning as sort of evenly as possible, especially when we're in the air.
Yeah, and she's in the air for a long time.
She is very good at the jumps. Adding weight down at the bottom, we talked about it just then, sprung versus unsprung. And the next thing that we've got to talk about in 2025 has to be gearboxes. Now, gearboxes have made a big old splash. They were the tech story at the start of the season, everyone wondering who's going to come out with them. And of course, Gates offered the belted purse, so the first elite downhill racer to win a race with a Gates, with a pinion gearbox and the Gates carbon drive was going to win €100,000. No one's done it.
Well, a junior did win.
Not elite.
But it's not elite, so it doesn't get the money. But Ollie Clark, who rides for Zero, the MS Zero team, he did win.
Probably pretty gutted about that.
Yeah, but it's like you said, at the start of the year, it was the big news story, right? And it's the most gearboxes we've ever seen line up.
With Intense, for example, they started the season with like 1 or 2 frames with the gearbox and then very quickly moved everyone onto the gearbox program. You've got your weight sort of benefits there, but also the durability, because there's no rear derailleur hanging off the back of the bike. Unsprung mass, you've got no cassette and rear mech on the rear axle banging up and down. There's a lot of benefits, some costs as well.
I've spoken to a few brands, and the ones that are really backing it say, do you know what, the potential when it comes to drag and stuff like that is negligible. And for something like downhill, where there hasn't been a ton of pedaling, not on the tracks we've seen so far really this year, it doesn't really make a huge difference.
Okay, so one area where there's been quite a bit of development but under the radar that people maybe don't think about so much is frame flex.
Yes.
So last year we saw, for example, Piron on his Common Cell Supreme running steel chainstays as opposed to the alloy ones that come on the stock bike. And then you see the likes of Mondraker and Atherton, for example, having different plates that fit sort of in the, well, as braces between the seat stays and the chainstays to change that sort of feel of the bike as it's going down a track. Why would anyone want to change the feel of their bike?
I would say not just feel, but what they're going for is probably grip,
Okay.
more than anything else. Feel to a regard will affect that as well, because if you have a super stiff bike, once it's leant over, if it's not giving at all, it's going to deflect, and the rider's going to have to absorb that and deal with that. They're also going to then have to absorb and deal with tyres pushing, not gripping, so having to counter that, which all those little micro adjustments soon add up and it can become quite tiring. So if the bike is able to conform a little bit more, it's probably more relaxing to ride, more comfortable, but also adds to the, boost the traction overall.
I guess this ties into the whole sort of prototyping thing. Mondraker, for example, with their top riders have been using prototype frames for the last couple of seasons.
Exactly, and then you mentioned Atherton, obviously they can not just remove braces and stuff, they can also change the tubes because of the way in which the frames are manufactured. And then we can't forget frameworks. Nico Mullally was using different materials, different frame materials. I think he got Sai from Kotick to build him a steel back end, maybe even a steel front end. So they've been experimenting with all sorts of stuff just to try to replicate and get the feel that they're after.
Yeah. Back in the day, you'd see an alloy frame or you'd see a carbon frame, and pretty much maybe a rocker link would be a different material. But now we're seeing a lot of frames that are multi-materialed, even as they are stock frames, and I think that's kind of cool because, with the Atherton, for example, the 3D printing technology that's come into that frame means that, there's true custom frames for every rider for different races. Gammux, again, they're able to sort of completely change their frames, and they're putting carbon plates in the ridges of the alloy frame to sort of change the stiffness characteristics and everything. Like, I think if you're like a budding engineer who, wanting to get into the world of mountain biking and work in that field, like there is a lot of space if you can become like a structural or a sports engineer. It's exciting stuff.
It is.
Last year, Joe Breeden rocked up at a few races with these big blue discs on the end of his handlebars, and he's now made an actual product, Get a Grip, I think they're called. But I have seen a few other people making a few homebrew ones this season who maybe just don't want to give Joe their money. What are we talking about?
So these discs sit on the end of the bars, and I think the idea is that when you're, especially under braking, where you're being pushed forwards, it rotates your hands out. By having something to push up against, it means when that happens, you don't then have to grip as tight. So it reduces arm pump, makes the, generally just takes a bit of the stress out of your arms.
Okay.
For Joe, I think it's made quite a big difference. He's refined them as well. They're not just, they don't look like discus things just stuffed on the end now. They're like just half a circle, isn't it? Like semicircle just stuck on it, like screwed in. It looks wicked. And any of those little mods you see like that, generally it's always going to, something to do with allowing them to probably feel more relaxed and more comfortable on the bike so they can just be fresher towards the end. Joe's a really good example of a rider that isn't afraid to try things and really, really push in terms of like testing and stuff like that. And I think now to be at the top, if you're not willing to do that, I don't think you can just show up. I think it'd be really rare now that anyone can just arrive, not even think about settings and stuff like that and just crack on and win. I think it's so professional now. It takes riders like Joe, like Luke Bruni, like Tane, all those people that put hours and hours and hours into the development and trying to tick off every single possible permutation or idea that might be bubbling away in their mind to try it in the off season and make sure when you hit that first round you're ready with all the tech you possibly need.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of people who are willing to try different things, we can't talk about, downhill racing this season, especially the end of the season, without mentioning Reece Wilson's nutcrackers. His little wings that were bolted to his seat tube so he could press the bike when he dropped it into a corner and have that little bit more control. He can squeeze it and that really sort of, help his speed down the hill.
It's to replicate, I believe it's to replicate the feel of riding a motocross bike.
Right.
Because that's kind of how you ride, you're squeezing your legs in like that. You're seeing that sort of stuff happening at these massive races and he's just not afraid to crack on and have a go.
Well, I think someone said to me, is it not a little bit risky having that? And he's like, well, downhill racing's so risky anyway, what's another 1% risk at the end of the day?
And he's got a fair point.
Fair point. So those are the bits of kit that are kind of on display out there to see, but there are obviously now and again little tidbits, little nuggets that come through of tech that we might see next year. Do you want to very quickly run us through what we could expect to see in Downhill 2026?
We're probably going to see a new Fox 40.
Okay.
That's been on a couple of racers' bikes this last weekend, just gone by. I would say there's going to be a new Boxer. Again, we've seen some spy shots, different lowers, different stanchions that have bits of different tech going on, which is really cool. New Saint brakes. I think we've seen those on Jackson's bike, so totally different caliper. Saint hasn't been updated since
the 1980s?
I think 2013.
2013.
Yes, so it's been a while.
Yeah.
And then potentially we've got electronic gears.
Yeah.
So
From SRAM.
From SRAM, just to tie in that whole sort of Eagle flight attendant system.
Okay, so EXO transmission DH maybe?
I would say,
7 speed.
Yeah, I think we saw it on Troy's bike.
Yes.
Yeah, so very cool.
So those are the bits of tech that we spotted in 2025. If you've seen any other interesting ones, drop them in the comments down below and give this video a like and subscribe to the channel, of course. Thanks very much, Rob, for your input. Now, if you want to see any more videos from us on screen, as both are bike check videos from Hardline 2025, where we looked at some of the downhill bikes that we have mentioned in this video.